Chapter 12. Boots Again. The pain in Roberto's arm raged like fire. He sat naked on a wooden chair by the wall. He did his best to relax his whole body. When he was little and about to get his smallpox vaccination, Sergio had told him that if he relaxed, it would hurt less. Sergio said that was true about all pain. He seemed right. The pain was slowly transforming into a steady ache. If he relaxed more, maybe he wouldn't feel it at all. His boy lay asleep on a couch nearby. He was curled on his side and he looked younger than ever. Yet he'd managed to get here from the grove by himself. And he'd found a way to cross that ditch with a sled. There was no telling what he could do. And there was no telling what he had already done. Had he told about Roberto? Was he responsible for Roberto's getting shot? Two men went through Roberto's clothes piled on the table. They argued over his German boots. They looked at him and barked questions. Roberto didn't speak, not a word. He knew that his boy had no idea what language he spoke. So, if he kept his mouth shut now, maybe no one would realize he was on the other side, that he was the enemy. The kettle on the stove whistled. A dog howled. Roberto hadn't noticed it before. It was the dog from his boy's village, the potato eater. It came out from under the couch and howled at the kettle. The canaries in the cage on the floor beside the couch made little peeping screeches and hopped from perch to perch. They had actually survived the day, protected by nothing but a few layers of quilt. Roberto's eyes searched the room for the cat. It was nowhere in sight. That didn't surprise him. That was the cat's trick. A woman came into the room. This house was larger than the houses back at his boy's village. It had at least 2 rooms. The woman poured the hot water from the kettle into a pottery basin painted with a profusion of red and yellow flowers. The embroidered throw on the back of the couch was bright, too. Red and blue animals ran among flowers. And the braided rug on the floor by the table was red and black and blue and yellow. Even the stove was painted with flowers. The room would have been cheerful if Roberto was just a friend stopping by. He'd have been happy to be here. The woman dropped a knife into the hot water in the basin. Then she picked up a small towel in one hand and a bottle of vodka in the other. She came over to Roberto. She said something. Roberto stared at the basin. She had dropped a knife in the water. A knife. Now he looked at the vodka. He thought of how his boy offered him vodka. He thought of how the 2 German soldiers at the work camp had died after drinking vodka. These people seemed half mad to drink something so strong. The very smell of it made him woozy. But there was the knife. Maybe being drunk right now would be a good idea. Then he remembered vomiting after the grappa episode on Memo's birthday. He shook his head. The woman didn't seem to notice his shaking head. She took his left arm by the elbow. She raised the bottle and poured vodka into his wound. The dull ache turned into searing pain. Roberto pulled his arm away. The woman went back to the basin and fished out the knife with a wooden spoon. She came back and grabbed his elbow firmly. Roberto looked away. He felt the knife jab. He let out a yelp. The bullet dropped with a small clunk on the wooden floor. Then came the searing pain again as the vodka rolled down his arm. And finally, the woman wrapped it tight in a strip of white cloth. She tied it in place with a smaller strip. Roberto wiped the tears from his cheeks. As the woman turned away, he took her skirt with his right hand. She looked at him. He pulled her as close as he could. His arm hurt so bad, but his gut hurt too. He gestured eating. He pressed on his stomach. Anyone could understand hunger. The woman hesitated. Her face was drawn. She was bone thin. She knew hunger. Roberto could see that plainly in her face. Her head tilted in a small, tired gesture of pity. Then her eyes changed. With a sudden fierceness, she yanked her skirt free and went to the table. He talked to the men without looking at Roberto. The language was gibberish to Roberto, of course, but he read the people's faces, their shoulders, their pointing fingers. Everything seemed to come back to those German boots. And now one man went over to the sled that sat by the front door. It had been untied, and the various provisions from the pillowcases stood against the far wall. He picked up the potato sack blanket and carried it to the table. The 3 of them talked and pointed at the German words printed on it and looked at Roberto and talked some more. So they thought he was a German soldier. He should have thrown away the potato sack and especially those boots. After all, they'd been the cause of Samuel's death. He should have stripped the boots off a corpse in his boy's village. He hadn't thought to do it, probably because he didn't want to touch the bodies. But oh, he hated those German boots. and he didn't want anyone to think he was a soldier. But what difference did it make, really? Whether he was a soldier or just a worker, it didn't matter. He was the enemy, the fascist. He'd built the pen the Polish girl sat in all day. He built airstrips in 2 different places so that German planes could bomb Soviet towns. He was the enemy. These people could argue all night, but Roberto couldn't listen to them all night. He got off the chair and lay on the floor. One of the men came over and pulled him to his feet. He handed him his clothes, all but the boots. Roberto got dressed. It hurt to pull the sweaters over his left arm. It scared him to look at the crusted blood on the wool of the sleeve where he'd been shot. Was he bleeding right now through the bandage the woman had put on his arm? And it hurt to use that arm to pull up his trousers. Yet an unexpected gratitude overwhelmed him. He felt thick and warm, and despite the pain, oddly safe in those peasant clothes. The man tied Roberto's hands behind his back. He tied his ankles. He said something. Roberto lay down on the floor again. He curled his back toward his knees as though to squeeze away the pain. Somewhere in the back of his head, an image of a hunchback shimmered. Was it Samuel? Was it Roberto himself? Then he was instantly asleep. When he woke, the room was full of men wearing small caps and muttering to one another. Roberto was sweaty and stiff. The house was tightly made, and a fire had been going all night. He shouldn't have slept fully dressed. One of the men from last night saw him awake. He untied Roberto and let him relieve himself in a chamber pot. Then he sat at the table and put a bowl in front of him. Roberto snaked his hands into his pockets and waited for someone to fill the bowl. That's when he realized his pockets were empty. He looked around the room. The things from his pockets lay in a small pile on the floor by the other provisions from the sled. Roberto jumped up and leaped for the pile. His fingers closed over the Polish girl's gift stone as one of the men grabbed him, his left arm. He let out a cry of pain and clutched the stone to his chest. The man pushed him back into his chair, and all the men were talking at once. They forced his hand open and examined the stone and talked. Then the man put the stone on the table. Roberto snatched it back. He looked from one man to the next. It was just a stone. They could see it was just a stone. The men talked. One of them yelled at him sharply. His boy woke up. A man said something to him. The boy cried out happily and ran to the table. The man put a bowl in front of him, too. Then the man poured from a pitcher into both bowls. The smell of goat soaked the air and rushed up to Roberto's nose. Steamy, foaming goat milk filled his bowl. Roberto stared in delight. He hadn't expected goats in this flat country. The man gave each boy a large hunk of bread. Roberto didn't need a second invitation. He put the stone in his pocket and ripped off pieces of the bread. He dunked them in the goat milk and ate as fast as he could. It was delicious. The men tried talking gently to him now. One of them spoke a few words of German. Roberto worked to keep his eyes dull. He prayed that his boy wouldn't remember what he'd said when he'd said that single German word to him, Wasser. He looked quickly at him. The boy just ate. Another man tried garbled Italian. Roberto's heart sped. He concentrated on eating. He refused to look at his boy, but now the man was saying the word for boy. The boy had to recognize it. It was what Roberto called him. The boy stood up. Roberto almost gagged on his bread. The boy took a pitcher of goat milk and refilled his own bowl. Then he refilled Roberto's. He went back to eating, making loud, slurping sounds. Roberto looked at the full bowl in front of him. It wasn't an accident. He was sure his boy had filled the bowl at that very moment to show he recognized Roberto's language. Did that mean he'd stand by him, that he wouldn't give him away? Or did that mean he'd blackmail him, like the food thief blackmailed Samuel back at the farm work camp? Another man tried some other language on Roberto, something odd that Roberto felt sure he'd never heard before. Roberto looked at them with a blank face, eating steadily. He finished his bread. He drank the remaining milk in the bowl and licked it clean. He was full and satisfied. He was ready to face anything. He looked at the men with clear eyes. They would wait him out. They would have to decide what to do with him without knowing anything about him. Their decision came swiftly. They tied his hands behind him and slapped his hat on his head. They put his boots in front of him. Roberto refused to step into the boots. Soldier boots. The men talked about this, too. Then one of them pushed him to the ground. Pain shot up his left arm. He groaned. The man jammed the boots onto Roberto's feet. They pushed him out the door. The morning air was mild with hardly a breeze. Roberto shuffled down a street, around a corner, pushed, always pushed, by the hands of a half-dozen men. He moved through fog so thick he could hardly see the ground beneath his feet. It was as though he walked in clouds. Most of the buildings were abandoned. Had the German and Italian soldiers made it past the ditch after all? But none of the doors Roberto passed were bashed in. No windows that he could see were broken. Something had happened to this town, but it didn't look like war, or like what Roberto knew of war. These buildings gave the sense of having been abandoned for years. They walked down another street, around another corner. Then they opened a door and pushed Roberto into what was clearly an official building. They stepped into a foyer, practically filling it. They pounded on the door on the right. It opened, and a somewhat stupefied man stood back as they all poured into that office. When the talking was over, Roberto was left sitting in a chair, his arms tied behind him and around the chair back so that he couldn't get up. The man whose office it was sat behind the desk, and the other men had finally been persuaded to go on their way. The man at the desk said something. He got up and walked around Roberto. He pointed at the hateful boots. He sat at the desk again. Roberto's boy came in. He talked to the man. The man talked and talked. The boy looked long at Roberto. He left. Maybe the town was too small to have a jail, or maybe prisoners of war weren't put in the jail. Roberto wiggled his hands. The rope was tight. His left arm throbbed now, and his right knee, the one he'd slammed on the ground yesterday evening as he raced through the woods, hurt again. But at least he wasn't cold. The office had no source of heat, so Roberto's layers of clothes served him well. And the hat had little flaps that covered his ears. They felt good. The man cleared his throat. He spoke again, but this time his voice was different. He wasn't asking questions or scolding. He was just talking. He sounded sad. Then he fell silent. He put his elbows on the desk and dropped his head in his palms. There were knocks on the door. A group of women came in with one of the men from this morning. Every single woman wore a kerchief on her head with a part in her hair showing at the forehead. It was like a school dress code, a uniform. And now Roberto noticed. All these women were bone thin, like the woman who'd cut out his bullet. And the men he'd seen were thin too. Snippets of old newsreels about famine in Ukraine came rushing into Roberto's head. That was years ago. These people had been hungry for years. The women looked at Roberto while the man talked on and on to them. There was no animus in their faces. There wasn't much of anything except a worried curiosity. They left. Roberto yawned. The man at the desk stood at him and yawned. Looked at him and yawned too. He stood and hitched up his loose trousers at the waist. He said something. Then he went out through a back door. He came back a few moments later, stretched, and sat down again. A group of children filed into the room and looked at Roberto in silence. Their faces were round, even over their stick-thin bodies. Their eyes were brown. They could have been children anywhere, children in Venice or in the streets of Munich or in the pen of Polish Jews. After a while, the man shooed the children out. A long period passed again. Roberto felt stiff all over. He pushed his legs out at full length and wiggled his toes inside his boots. The man glanced at him. The skin on his knee tightened. A scab had formed over the spot where he'd hurt himself yesterday. How long would it take for a scab to form over the bullet hole in his arm? His boy came in holding a sweet bun bigger than both his hands. Roberto looked at it in amazement. So did the man. It was clear the boy held a treasure. He talked to the man, who licked his bottom lip several times. The boy sniffed loudly at the bun every so often as he talked. Why didn't he just take a huge bite? That's what Roberto wanted to do. Gobble it up. Roberto's stomach growled. The boy and the man looked over at him. The boy left. The man said a few words to Roberto. He pulled a watch from his pocket and glanced at it. It had to be past noon. It was definitely lunchtime. The man walked behind Roberto and checked the knot that held his wrists together. He rested his hand softly on Roberto's head for an instant. Then he bolted the office door from the inside and went out through the back door. Within seconds, the back door reopened. The boy ran in, holding peasant boots under his arm. In one hand was a hunting knife. Roberto jerked himself to attention. Every muscle tensed. The boy put the boots on the floor and ran behind Roberto. He sawed at the ropes on Roberto's wrists till they split. Roberto stood up. He was free. The boy jammed the peasant boots onto Roberto's stomach. "Scoro, busy!" He ran out the door, holding the knife. Roberto clutched the boots, dumbfounded. Then he raced after the boy. They went through a small room with a chamber pot in one corner and out another door to the outside. They were behind the building now, in a bare courtyard that several other buildings backed into. The sun had burned off the fog, and the surfaces of everything glistened. The boy hissed something and pointed at the boots. He was right, of course. Roberto sat on the ground and pulled off the German boots. He put on the peasant ones. Now he looked like just any other Ukrainian kid. The boy stuffed Roberto's old boots into a crate behind the building next door. He pulled a roll from his pocket, dropped it in Roberto's lap, and ran between two buildings. Roberto ran after him, but no one was between the buildings. His boy had disappeared. No, he couldn't have deserted him so soon. Roberto needed him to escape. He needed him. Roberto ran to the front of the buildings and stopped. He peeked out at the street. It was empty. Lunchtime. Every last soul was off eating. He came out from the alley and ran down the block, looking around wildly for his boy. A door opened ahead of him. Roberto ducked between two buildings. He heard men talking. Their voices got closer. He crouched and turned his back on them. He felt like he was going to choke. The voices and footsteps passed. Roberto stood up. He realized he was still clutching the roll his boy had given him. He took a big bite and peeked at the road. A man came out of that same door, crossed the street, and got into a small truck. The sides were wooden slats connected together with steel cords. One of the slats was broken, and Roberto could see the bed of the truck was empty. A surge of energy filled him. Could he climb into the back of the truck without the driver seeing him? The truck drove off. Roberto clenched his teeth. He had to be faster in taking whatever opportunities came up. He had to be fast like his boy, fast like Memo and Sergio. Another truck was parked behind where the first one had been, an identical truck. Roberto couldn't see into the back of it. It might be completely full with no room at all for a stowaway. He looked up and down the road. Nothing else seemed to offer even the smallest hint of a promise. He had to chance it. He dashed across the street and climbed into the back of the truck. It was blessedly empty. He lay flat onto the wooden bottom. He didn't even dare to finish the roll clutched in his right hand. Anyone who looked in the back of the truck could see him. Anyone. He heard a door slam, then footsteps. Roberto's breathing was too loud. He held his breath. The footsteps stopped. A voice called out. Another voice answered, and someone ran toward the truck. Roberto flattened his palms onto the truck bed, letting go of the roll. There was nothing to hold on to. He had the unbearable sensation of falling. The truck doors slammed. Both of them, one after the other. The truck engine revved up and it rolled down the street. Roberto found he was panting. The sun was high. He squinted his eyes against it. The truck turned, and he slid. He clanked against the truck side. Oh no, he was sure the people in the truck cab had heard. But the truck didn't stop. It went slowly through the streets. Roberto felt around for the roll. He found it and ate. He was grateful the buildings were only 1 story high. No one could just happen to look out at an upper window and see a boy in the back of a truck stuffing bread into his mouth. He would make it out of town. But the truck turned another corner and stopped abruptly.